the Russian Pacific Fleet, as an integral part of the Navy and the armed forces of the Russian Federation as a whole, is a means of ensuring Russia's military security in the Asia-Pacific region. To carry out its assigned tasks, the Pacific Fleet has in its ranks strategic missile submarines, multipurpose nuclear and diesel submarines, surface ships for operations in the ocean and near-sea zones, naval anti-submarine and fighter aircraft, ground forces, and units of ground and coastal forces. Hello, dear viewers. This video will explore the current state of the Russian Pacific Fleet. Let's conduct a detailed analysis of the current state of the Russian Pacific Fleet and consider its development prospects. We'll learn what fleet Russia inherited from the USSR and what fleet it still has as of 2026. You'll see how the demilitarization and degradation of this Russian fleet took place. You'll see how Russia prepared replacements for decommissioned Soviet capital ships. You'll see how Russia lost its entire ocean-going fleet and transformed from a global maritime power into a regional one. Let's move on to an analysis of the Russian Pacific Fleet. We'll start with the largest ships of the first rank and move on to ships of the second, third, and fourth ranks. That is, from the largest to the smallest. Then we'll look at the submarine fleet. So, as of 2026, this fleet has one missile cruiser, the Varyag. It was built in Mykolaiv, Ukraine, during the Soviet era. This is a Project 1164 land cruiser. It was launched in 1983. So, by 2026, it's practically ancient scrap metal. It is the flagship of the Russian Pacific Fleet. It is a first-rank ship, meaning it's the largest. Since its construction, the Varyag hasn't undergone any modernization. This means it has ancient electronic equipment dating back to the Soviet era, dating back to the 1970s and 1980s. However, it has undergone repairs, including major ones. For example, in 2006 to 2008, it underwent such repairs and had its propulsion system replaced. This means its service life was extended by approximately 15 years. Therefore, by 2026, it too will have already exhausted its design life. I'd like to point out that the cruiser uses a Ukrainian-made gas turbine propulsion system. It was developed at the Ukrainian state-owned enterprise Zorya-Mashproekt. Russia has become completely dependent on Ukraine for such systems, and continues to be so. Ukraine enjoyed a monopoly on such systems during the Soviet Union, and this remained the case after the collapse of the USSR. As of 2026, Russian industry was unable to produce such systems. This means that without Ukrainian components, this cruiser will not sail for long. And since 2014, Ukraine has ceased military cooperation with Russia due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This means that the cruiser Varyag is already in a state of disrepair and could break down at any moment. This is similar to what happened with the only remaining aircraft carrier, the Admiral Kuznetsov. Its propulsion system failed, and Russia was unable to replace it. The ship is awaiting decommissioning and scrapping. Incidentally, it was also built in Mykolaiv, Ukraine, and it also used a Ukrainian power plant. So, as we can see, Russia had no replacement for such ships. And without Ukrainian components and maintenance, such ships cannot sail for long. They also cannot extend their service life. This means the invasion of Ukraine dealt a crushing blow to the largest ships of the Russian Navy. Some have already been decommissioned, while others remain afloat in disrepair. Let's move on. The Russian Pacific Fleet also has 4 large Project 1155M anti-submarine ships. According to Russian classification, these are frigates. According to NATO classification, they are destroyers. This is because the displacement of this ship is 7,000 tons. All ships with a displacement of over 5,000 tons are classified as destroyers, first-rank ships. Frigates, on the other hand, are second-rank ships and have a displacement of up to 4,000 tons. This ship was designed in the USSR with this size limitation in mind. But then, the weight and size specifications were abandoned. The Project 1155 vessel was significantly increased in size. This was because they wanted to install newer sonar equipment on this type of ship, which required a redesign of the entire design. As a result, the ship ended up being overweight, even though it was designed as a frigate and for the mission specifically assigned to frigates. Accordingly, both the USSR and Russia still classify this ship as a frigate. That is, in terms of combat capabilities, it's a frigate, a second-rank ship of medium size. But in terms of displacement, it's a destroyer, a large first-rank ship. So, it's a large first-rank ship, but in terms of combat effectiveness, it's classified as a less powerful medium-sized ship of the second rank. This is because Soviet ships lagged far behind similar ships in developed countries in terms of combat capabilities. In short, all for Project 1155 frigates were also launched during the Soviet era. They've undergone numerous repairs. They've also undergone modernization, but these have been partial. In fact, the ships still use ancient Soviet electronic equipment. Most of them are like that. So, how modern these ships can be considered, say, in 2026, is up to you to decide. After all, the USSR collapsed in 1991. And the ships used Soviet-era technology and equipment from the 1970s and 1980s. So these ships can already be considered ancient, and they've long since ceased to meet modern requirements. What's noteworthy is that they also use Ukrainian gas turbine propulsion systems, manufactured by the Ukrainian company Zorya-Mashproekt. This means that without Ukrainian components, Russia will be unable to continue servicing these ships. And Russia has been unable to create similar gas turbine units. This means that Russia will not be able to use these frigates for long. This is the end of the large long-range combat ships of the Russian Pacific Fleet. Next come the ships that guard distant maritime zones and the ships that serve in the near maritime zone. These are second-rank ships and are smaller in size. There are for Project 20380 Starogashie-class corvettes and one Project 20385 Gremyashie-class corvette. All 5 of these corvettes are new-build ships, launched between 2015 and 2021. There are also a number of inaccuracies in the comparison between the international and Russian classifications. The point is that Russian ships are rated higher in size, but inferior in combat capabilities. This means that Russian ships are large, but their combat capabilities are lower. Their combat capabilities are lower than those of ships of the same type according to international classification. On the other hand, this is hardly surprising. It's difficult to call Russia a maritime power. Its navy has always been weaker than those of many of its potential adversaries worldwide. Therefore, the ships significantly lag behind the capabilities of similarly ranked ships from developed countries. Russia's newest Starogashie corvettes are a case in point. According to international classifications, they are frigates. After all, their displacement is 1,800 tons. Ships with a displacement of over 1,500 tons are classified as frigates. Therefore, this Russian Starogashie-class corvette could also be classified as a frigate. However, in terms of combat capabilities, these ships are classified as corvettes. Because they were designed to protect nearby maritime zones and the coast, they are therefore classified as corvettes under Russian classification. The Starogashie was designed to perform the following missions. For operations in the near maritime zone of the state, combating enemy surface ships and submarines. For artillery support of the naval landing force during naval landing operations by delivering missile and artillery strikes against ships and vessels at sea and bases. To patrol the area of responsibility for the purpose of blockade. As we can see, their combat capabilities place these ships specifically among corvettes. And in terms of size, they belong to frigates. Generally speaking, frigates and corvettes are both patrol ships. Frigates are simply larger, while corvettes can be half the size of frigates. Consequently, frigates are better suited to long-range naval missions, while corvettes are more suited to close-in naval zones. However, they can also be used to escort first-rank ships in long-range naval zones. Overall, these Russian corvettes are quite modern and carry state-of-the-art electronics and equipment. Therefore, they can be quite effective in close-in maritime missions, which is precisely what they were designed for. That concludes the list of second-rank ships of the Russian Pacific Fleet. That's all there is. Next, we move on to the smaller third-rank ships. Russia has one Project 1234 Ovid small missile ship on its Pacific coast, launched in 1984 during the Soviet era. Most ships of this type have already been scrapped. But one still somehow remains afloat. This ship is called Smerch. It has essentially been afloat for over 40 years, making it obsolete. There are also 7 Project 1124 Albatross small anti-submarine ships. All of them were also Soviet-built, launched between 1985 and 1991. They are also obsolete. Their equipment is ancient Soviet, dating back to the 1970s and 1980s. It should be noted that, among other things, Soviet industry lagged far behind that of developed countries. Therefore, ships built under the USSR also lagged far behind those of developed countries in terms of technology. This was especially evident in the development of electronic equipment. Here, the USSR's lag was probably greatest. Consequently, even these Soviet ships will be significantly outdated by 2026. It turns out that the Russian Pacific Fleet has only 8 ships, of the 3rd rank. And all of them are obsolete. And then come the vessels of the 4th rank. These are the smallest units of the fleet. These include boats and cutters. Mostly cutters. There are 10 Project 1241 Molniya missile boats. Only one of them is new, launched in 2021. The rest were built during the Soviet era. I'd like to point out that this one new boat can't be called new either. Firstly, because it's a Soviet-era boat design. After the USSR collapsed, Russia continued building them. In 1992, construction of the boat, designated R-29, began. Then economic perestroika began. An economic and financial crisis ensued. There was no money to continue construction. As a result, this boat couldn't be completed. It wasn't launched until 2001. In other words, this ancient Soviet boat was essentially finished. Its internal equipment is also ancient, Soviet era. Therefore, its combat capabilities are very poor compared to modern boats of a similar type. The Russian Pacific Fleet also has 5 Project 14159 Flamingo anti-sabotage patrol boats. All were built in the Soviet Union in the late 1980s. Therefore, we won't go into detail about them. The mere fact that these boats were built during the Soviet era speaks volumes. The fleet also has 6 Project 21980 Grachanark special-purpose boats. These are new boats, launched between 2013 and 2020. Although they are new for Russia, they were quite primitive for the global industry. The fleet also has 2 Project 266M Aquamarine M minesweepers and 7 Project 1265 Yasen-M minesweepers. All of these minesweepers were built during the Soviet era. Of the new minesweepers, the fleet received only 3 Project 12700 Alexandrite minesweepers. They were launched in 2020 to 2021. This means that by 2026, the Russian Pacific Fleet had only 21 boats. Of these, only 6 can be considered new. All the rest are obsolete, dating back to the Soviet era. There were also 12 minesweepers, of which only 3 were new. The remaining minesweepers were Soviet-era vessels. This is the end of the Russian Navy's combat fleet. However, there are still a number of landing ships of various ranks. These ships do not engage in naval combat, their purpose is to transport and land troops. The Russian Pacific Fleet operates for large Soviet-era landing ships, 1 Project 1171 Taper and 3 Project 775. All of these ships are second-class ships. They were launched during the Soviet era. Some are 45 to 50 years old. They have long since exhausted their service life, but they are still in use. Because the fleet has not received any new ships for 2026. The Pacific Fleet also has 5 landing craft. Of these, 3 are Project 1176 Udaloy-class, 2 of which are Soviet-built and 1 Russian-built, launched in 2007. There is also 1 Project 11770 Cerna-class boat and 1 Project 21820 Dyugan-class boat, launched in 2010 and 2013, respectively. It's also worth noting that minesweepers and landing craft don't engage in naval combat and aren't capable of achieving naval superiority. They are more like military support vessels. Minesweepers clear mines from waters, while landing craft transport and land troops and cargo. Therefore, in our calculations, we will primarily consider warships capable of achieving naval superiority. That is, those ships capable of engaging in naval combat with other ships. Minesweepers and landing ships will be considered separately, as support vessels. This means that the Russian Pacific Fleet has very few warships and boats capable of achieving naval superiority. This is especially true for large ships. After all, they are the backbone of any fleet. And only they are capable of achieving naval superiority. This means that the Russian Pacific Fleet's surface ships total 5 first-rank ships, 5 second-rank ships, 8 third-rank ships, and 21 fourth-rank boats. Most of these are ancient and obsolete, dating back to the Soviet era. There are also 12 minesweepers for large landing ships and 5 landing boats. Most of these vessels are also obsolete. That's the entire composition of the Pacific Fleet surface fleet. It's actually quite modest. This is especially true of the Rancor 1 ships. They are practically already lost. All that remains is ancient Soviet scrap metal. Next, we move on to the submarine fleet. Russia's submarine fleet has proven to be more developed than its surface fleet. As of 2026, the Russian Pacific Fleet has 5 Project 949A-M anti-nuclear powered missile submarines. These are third-generation submarines. All were laid down during the Soviet era. Russia completed some of them after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But as is becoming clear, these are all fairly ancient submarines, employing ancient, outdated Soviet industrial technologies. They were launched between the mid-1980s and mid-1990s. For example, these submarines were replaced by new Project 885 Yasen submarines, whose design began in 1977. This is because the anti-submarines were designed even earlier, in the late 1960s and early 1970s. They were created using the technology of that time. In essence, these submarines are quite ancient, and have long since ceased to meet modern requirements. To replace them, Russia has already begun producing Yasen-class submarines. These submarines are also quite old. As we previously noted, they were developed in the USSR since the late 1970s. Serial production was scheduled to begin in the 1990s. But then the USSR collapsed. It then became clear how far the Soviet Union technically lagged behind developed countries. Ultimately, these submarines never entered production. Russia began modernizing them using Western components and modern electronics. This resulted in the modernized version of the Soviet submarine Project 885M, or simply Yasen-M. The M stands for modernized. The first such submarine was laid down in 1993 and launched in 2010. For a long time, no new submarines of this type were commissioned. This was due to the perestroika of the Russian Federation following the collapse of the USSR. The economy was extremely weak, and there was not enough money for new submarines. Further submarines of this class will be laid down starting in 2009, and the fleet will begin receiving them starting in 2017. These are old submarines, but relatively recently built. As of 2026, the Russian Pacific Fleet has only 2 such submarines, Kr-573 Novosibirsk and Kr-571 Krasnoyarsk. The Russian Navy also has 1 Project 09852 submarine, the BS-329 Belgorod. This is a Russian special-purpose nuclear submarine, the only Project 09852 submarine, carrying Poseidon-class unmanned underwater vehicles and autonomous deep-sea stations. It is part of the main Directorate of Deep-Sea Research of the Russian Ministry of Defense. It was built at the Sevmash shipyard from 1992 to 2020. Initially, it was built under Project 949A Anti. Simply put, Russia took an unfinished Antia-class submarine, unfinished during the Soviet era, and converted it into a special-purpose submarine. In fact, it is quite ancient. As we noted earlier, Antia-class submarines were designed in the USSR in the early 1970s. However, a redesigned version was launched in 2019. This means, at a minimum, the electronics there must be quite modern. Russia has begun to use foreign electronics from developed countries in its production, thereby enhancing the combat capabilities of Soviet and Russian weapons. This also applies to the Navy. So, all the submarine projects we've mentioned are cruise missile carriers. One of them, a special-purpose submarine, can also carry them. These are Projects 949 Anti, 885 Yasen, and 09852, designated BS-329. A total of 8 nuclear-powered submarines carry cruise missiles. All of them are ancient Soviet designs, albeit modernized in Russia. Most of them were launched in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Only a few submarines are relatively new, built since 2017. This means that most of them have already reached the end of their operational life or will soon do so. Some of them, 3 or 3 submarines, are quite new and still have significant operational life left. They could still be in use for a long time. The Russian Pacific Fleet also has 2 Soviet-era third-generation multipurpose nuclear submarines. These are Project 971 Shuka-B submarines. These submarines are quite old, having been designed in the 1970s. The first were launched in 1983. Their production continued until 2001. These submarines were the main multipurpose nuclear submarines in the Russian Federation until 2020. This means that their service life was approximately 25 to 30 years. They were replaced by the same Project 885 Yasen submarines, which we discussed earlier. The Pacific Fleet has 2 such Project 971 Shuka-B multipurpose nuclear submarines, the K-19 Kuzbas and the K-295 Samara. They were launched in 1992 and 1994, respectively. In other words, they have all been in service for over 30 years. This exceeds their estimated service life. As we can see, the Russian Navy still operates nuclear submarines that are essentially Soviet-era. Only 3 of the 10 submarines we examined are newly built. The rest were launched long ago and have already exhausted their service life. And there's nothing to replace them with. Moreover, after the collapse of the USSR, Russia was able to completely renew its entire fleet of nuclear-powered strategic missile-carrying submarines. These are submarines capable of carrying ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads. Russia operates 5 such submarines in the Pacific Ocean: Kr-550 Alexander Nevsky, Kr-551 Vladimir Monomakh, Kr-552 Prince Oleg, Kr-553 Generalissimo Suvorov, and Kr-554 Emperor Alexander III. All are relatively new, having been launched between 2010 and 2022. All of these submarines belong to Project 955 Borei. Their design began in the 1980s in the USSR. After the collapse of the USSR, in the 1990s, Russia realized that the submarines were no longer up to modern standards. In the late 1990s, it was decided to modify and modernize the design. Thus, the first submarine of this type was launched in 2008. Essentially, the Russian industry began producing a modernized version of the Soviet submarine. But all of them were relatively new. Therefore, all submarines of this type have a significant service life and can be considered new in the Russian fleet. This is the end of the nuclear submarines of the Russian Pacific Fleet. In total, we have 8 submarines carrying cruise missiles, 5 of which are already obsolete. 2 obsolete multipurpose nuclear submarines. And 5 new strategic missile submarines, nuclear weapons carriers and ballistic missile carriers. A total of 15 nuclear submarines. As we can see, the nuclear submarine fleet of the Russian Pacific Fleet is quite outdated and can no longer fulfill its role. The same is true for the Russian surface fleet. However, the Russian missile submarines are completely new. This means that the Russian Federation has tried with all its might to maintain its nuclear triad, which includes these 5 strategic missile submarines. The rest of the fleet is a residual asset. It's effectively obsolete. Russia hasn't had time to update it. The same applies to its diesel-powered submarine fleet. The Pacific Fleet has for Project 877 Poltus diesel-electric submarines, the BE-394 Nerlat, the BE-64 UST Kamchatsk, the BE-94 UST Bolsheretsk, and the BE-187 Komsomolsk-on-Amur. All of these submarines were built and launched during the Soviet era, from 1988 to 1991. They have reached the end of their service life. Some have already been decommissioned and sent for scrapping. For example, the B-190 Krasnokamensky, launched in 1992, was the newest of the submarines. This indicates that the submarines are in a state of disrepair, and their service life is no more than 30 years. Russia has begun upgrading its fleet of these diesel-powered boats as well. But the pace is too slow, and so the Navy still uses these old Soviet-era boats. They were replaced by Project 636.3 Varyag submarines. From 2017 to 2025, the Russian Pacific Fleet received 6 of these submarines. These are new, old boats because they are newly built. But the project itself is quite ancient. Their design began back in the 1970s under the USSR, based on Project 877. But construction of the ships themselves began in the mid-1990s, after the collapse of the USSR. Therefore, the first of them are already approaching the end of their service life. However, these boats are still being produced in Russia as of 2025. In fact, Russia continues to produce these Soviet-era boats, modernizing them. They are a Russian modification of the Soviet export Project 877 EKM Poltava submarines. Essentially, the Russian Pacific Fleet has 10 diesel-electric submarines, 4 of which are obsolete, while 6 are relatively new. The fleet also has 15 nuclear-powered submarines, 8 of which are also obsolete. This means that Russia has more nuclear submarines in the Pacific Ocean than diesel-powered ones. It's important to note that the 5 nuclear-powered submarines are strategic missile carriers. They are not designed for combat with other submarines or ships. Their primary mission is to carry out covert missile strikes on land, on enemy territory. This means that only 10 of these submarines remain capable of achieving naval superiority. That leaves 10 nuclear-powered and 10 diesel-powered submarines. The 5 missile carriers belong to the nuclear triad. Now let's look at how many ships and submarines remain in the Russian Pacific Fleet. In total, the entire surface and submarine fleet of the Russian Pacific Fleet has this number of ships and submarines: 5 first-rank ships, 5 second-rank ships, 8 third-rank ships, and 21 boats. These are combat ships. Auxiliary, transport, and landing vessels include 12 minesweepers, 4 second-rank landing ships, and 5 fourth-rank landing craft. The submarine fleet consists of 8 nuclear-powered cruise missile submarines, 5 nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines, 2 multipurpose nuclear-powered submarines, and 10 diesel-electric submarines. This is the current state of affairs as of 2026. In total, Russia has 60 surface ships and boats in the Pacific Ocean, as well as 15 nuclear-powered and 10 diesel-powered submarines. Only 39 of these ships and boats, including 20 submarines, are designed for naval combat. These are the ships and submarines designed to achieve naval superiority. The rest have other purposes. As the analysis showed, most of these ships and submarines are obsolete. They were built during the Soviet era or were developed in Russia following its collapse according to Soviet designs. Therefore, they cannot be considered modern. Of Russia's modern fleet, only the strategic missile carriers, which are part of its nuclear triad, have been updated. The rest of the fleet is obsolete. This applies primarily to the largest first-rank surface ships. Russia is virtually never building them. Russian industry has only been able to begin replacing smaller ships, ships of the second, third, and fourth ranks. And the pace of construction is not keeping pace with the replacement of ships decommissioned. Consequently, the Russian fleet has sharply declined and continues to decline as of 2026. To understand how much the Russian Pacific Fleet has shrunk and degraded, let's compare the number of ships in this fleet in the late 1980s, under the USSR, and in 2026, under the Russian Federation. In 1989, the Pacific Fleet consisted of 170 surface ships of various classes, 117 submarines, and 128 combat boats. By 2026, it had only 18 surface ships of various classes, 25 submarines, and 21 combat boats. This includes the fleet's combat ships. There are also auxiliary vessels, including 12 minesweepers, for large landing ships, and 5 landing boats. In total, this amounts to 34 surface ships, 25 submarines, and 26 boats. Therefore, it can be said that from the collapse of the USSR to 2026, the Pacific Fleet has been reduced by approximately a fifth. There were 170 surface ships, and only 34 remain. There were 117 submarines, and only 25 remain. There were 128 boats, and only 26 remain. By all indicators, the fleet has been reduced by a factor of 5. Moreover, in 1989, the fleet had modern ships and submarines for the time. All of them had sufficient service life. The fleet was constantly being renewed, and decommissioned ships were replaced by new ones. Russia was unable to continue this renewal and was unable to replace the old ships with new ones. Therefore, by 2026, the core of the fleet was now comprised of obsolete ships built during the Soviet era. This is especially true for the largest first-class ships. To better illustrate the extent to which Russia's Pacific Fleet has deteriorated, consider the example of the South Korean Navy. Let's compare the number of ships in the South Korean fleet and their technical condition. It's worth noting that the Republic of Korea is one of the most developed countries in the world. Its industry produces modern, world-class products. These products are in demand worldwide. Meanwhile, Russian industry has proven to be one of the most backward in the world. Suffice it to say that as of 2026, South Korea produces modern electronics and an automotive industry. Russia, however, is virtually non-existent. Russia is unable to produce modern smartphones, computers, or even automobiles. This suggests that South Korean ships will be much more modern and technologically advanced, even if some of them were built at the same time as Russian ships. For example, in the 1990s, Russia produced virtually no modern electronics at all. Accordingly, ships built during this period could only be equipped with ancient Soviet electronics. Alternatively, Russia would have had to buy modern foreign electronics from, say, South Korea. But countries rarely sell their military electronics. And civilian electronics were significantly inferior to military ones. Therefore, Russian ships built in the 1990s, and even in the 2000s and later, were significantly inferior to South Korean ships built in the 1990s. This is just one example. But as our analysis showed, Russia didn't have many new ones. The vast majority of its fleet consists of ancient Soviet vessels. Their electronics are correspondingly inferior. The South Korean Navy has over 200 surface ships, boats, and submarines. The Russian Pacific Fleet, meanwhile, has only 85 ships, boats, and submarines. The South Korean Navy has approximately 200 surface ships and boats, while Russia has 60. Friends, I have a video review comparing the Russian Pacific Fleet and the Republic of Korea Navy on my channel. If you're interested in learning more about the balance of power between the fleets, you can find it on my channel. A link to the comparison video is also provided in the description below this video. It provides a detailed analysis of the two countries' naval compositions. It shows how many and what kind of ships and submarines each navy has, and their current status. Based on this analysis, it can be concluded that the South Korean Navy is several times more powerful than the Russian Pacific Navy. It turns out that in terms of quantity, the Republic of Korea's navy outnumbers the Russian Pacific Fleet by a factor of 3. And in terms of quality, South Korea's superiority is even greater. The author wanted to demonstrate how significantly the Pacific Fleet shrank and degraded after the collapse of the USSR. It turns out that small countries like South Korea have navies far more powerful than those of the enormous Russian Federation. Yet, in the Pacific Ocean, there are larger countries than South Korea, whose navies are larger than South Korea's. There are also countries capable of quickly producing modern ships, including large first-class ships. For example, Japan, China, the United States, and others. This map clearly shows the sizes of these countries. You can compare the sizes of Russia and the Republic of Korea yourself. Furthermore, the South Korean fleet has 3 times more ships than the Russian Pacific Fleet. Moreover, as of 2026, the Russian Pacific Fleet continues to shrink. This is because the rate of construction of new ships in Russia is very low. Russia is failing to replace its decommissioned Soviet ships and boats. Meanwhile, the the South Korean fleet is constantly being replenished with new ships and expanding through the construction of new, larger vessels. Moreover, the South Korean Navy consists primarily of modern and new ships. The Russian Navy, meanwhile, is comprised of ancient Soviet vessels. The South Korean Navy is being replenished with large first-rank ships. Meanwhile, the Russian Navy did not receive a single first-rank ship from 1991 to 2026. Russian industry has effectively lost the ability to produce first-rank combat ships. This means that, overall, the Russian Pacific Fleet is extremely outdated and unable to perform its assigned missions in modern conditions. Its core consists of Soviet-era surface ships, boats, and submarines. The only exception is the missile-carrying submarines that form part of Russia's nuclear triad. It's also clear that all Russian state naval modernization programs have been a complete failure. This means the Pacific Fleet's future development prospects are in serious doubt. As of 2026, it continues to decline and deteriorate. To substantiate these claims, let's provide some examples. According to the State Armament Program, the Russian Pacific Fleet was supposed to receive 54 new surface ships, 16 multipurpose submarines, and 8 nuclear-powered missile submarines from 2011 to 2020. In other words, all of this was supposed to be delivered to the fleet over the course of 8 to 9 years, from 2011 to 2020. And what do we have as of 2026? That is, 5 years after the end of these rearmament plans. The fleet has received only 5 new medium-sized ships, 2 multipurpose submarines, and 5 nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines. In total, this is less than 8% of the previously planned number. Moreover, all of this was supposed to be delivered by 2020, according to plans. But we are looking at the results of what has already been delivered to the fleet by 2026. That is, 5 years after the end of these plans. Plus, new ships were also planned for delivery from 2020 to 2026. This represents at least another 50% of the previously indicated number of ships planned for delivery to the fleet from 2011 to 2020. So, in total, the Pacific Fleet received only 5%, at most, of what the Russian military planned to provide it. And, crucially, by 2026, the fleet still hasn't received a single large first-class surface ship. This represents a complete failure of the entire state rearmament program. Meanwhile, in 2025, Russian President Putin received a government award for his significant contribution to the development of the Russian Navy. President Putin's contribution to the development of the Russian Navy can be clearly seen in the state of the Russian Pacific Fleet, and also in the implementation of the state rearmament program, or, more accurately, the complete failure of that program. So, they awarded the award for the complete failure of the entire rearmament program. Let's now learn more about this rearmament program. As part of this program, an agreement was reached in 2011 to purchase 4 Mistral-class amphibious assault ships. 2 of them were to join the Russian Pacific Fleet. The plan was to equip the fleet with over 20 corvettes, 5 to 10 small missile ships, at least 14 frigates, and 6 large landing ships. And here we are, already approaching 2026. The fleet has never received most of these ships and boats. And it likely never will, at least not in the near future. All plans for Russian naval construction have been completely thwarted. The existing fleet is being decommissioned and sent to idle, storage, or disposal. As of 2026, the Russian Pacific Fleet has approximately 1/10 of what was previously planned. This includes 5 strategic nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines, 8 cruise missile submarines, including 1 special-purpose submarine, 2 multipurpose nuclear-powered submarines, and 10 diesel-electric submarines. 5 deep-sea and ocean-going surface ships remain. These include large Rank 1 ships, such as cruisers, frigates, and large anti-submarine ships. The Pacific Fleet also has 5 corvettes, 12 minesweepers, for large landing ships, 5 landing craft, and 34 near-sea surface ships, mostly boats, remaining in service as of 2026. 11 special-purpose boats, primarily anti-sabotage, remain. The fleet currently has only half the number of ships planned for acquisition under the Naval Armament Program from 2011 to 2020. Moreover, the fleet itself has shrunk during this time. This is significantly less than planned for 2020. This is because the fleet largely consists of older, Soviet-built ships. As an example, the Russian Pacific Fleet had at least 7 first-rank combat surface ships in 2011, as well as for large second-rank landing ships. These are vessels capable of performing missions in distant waters. Simply put, they can be used anywhere in the world, on oceans and seas. A total of 11 such large ships are in service. All of these ships were built during the Soviet era. By 2020, it was planned to deliver at least 14 first-rank frigates and 6 large second-rank landing ships to the fleet. In addition, 2 large Mistral-class amphibious assault ships. This brings the total to at least 22 large ships. This means the military planned to deliver at least 22 large ships capable of operating in distant waters to the Pacific Fleet. This means that at least 22 new large ships were to be added to the existing 11 large ships. First-class destroyers were also planned. This would total approximately 35 large ships. And this is only for 2020. From 2020 to 2026, the fleet was also to be replenished with ships. This means at least 10 more new ships. Judging by the planned construction rate from 2011 to 2020, the number of large ships in the Russian Pacific Fleet by 2026 was supposed to be at least 50 units. Furthermore, many aging ships were to be replaced with new ones, in much greater numbers than previously available. By this time, the Russian Pacific Fleet was supposed to be completely renewed with the delivery of new ships. But what do we actually have as of 2026? The Russian Pacific Fleet has 1 cruiser and 4 anti-submarine frigates in service. That's 5 first-rank ships in total. There are also 5 second-rank combat ships. That's 10 large ships that can be used in distant maritime zones. There are also 4 obsolete second-rank large landing ships. Let's say that's 14 ships for maritime and oceanic zones. So, instead of the 35 to 50 new large ships that the Pacific Fleet was supposed to have by 2026, only 5 obsolete first-rank ships, 5 new second-rank ships, and 4 obsolete second-rank landing ships remain in service. A total of 14 large ships, and only 10 of them are combat ships. Particular attention should be paid to large first-rank ships. Almost all of them have long since exhausted their service life and should have been decommissioned and scrapped. Russian industry is still attempting to renew second-rank ships, but Russia has encountered significant problems with larger first-rank ships. Friends, I would like to once again draw your attention to the fact that, according to the Russian state naval rearmament programs, the Pacific Fleet was supposed to receive 35 to 50 new large ships of the first and second ranks. This was between 2011 and 2026. Instead, the Pacific Fleet has been further reduced in size, and no new large ships have arrived. Instead of large cruisers, destroyers, or frigates, the Russian fleet received only 5 new second-rank corvettes. Corvettes are ships much smaller than frigates, sometimes half their size. This means that the Russian military has begun replacing large ships with smaller ones. And the fleet never received these large ships. As a result, the Pacific Fleet has only 5 obsolete Soviet first-rank ships and 5 new second-rank corvettes. It also has 4 ancient second-rank landing ships built in the 1970s. So, instead of receiving up to 50 new large ships, the fleet received only 5 small corvettes. And no large ships at all. This means Russia has no replacements for the large Soviet ships. In fact, instead of developing the fleet, its degradation continued. It can be concluded that by 2026, the Russian Pacific Fleet has completely deteriorated and can no longer fulfill its assigned missions. Moreover, as of 2026, the degradation of the Russian fleet continues. This begs the question, what will happen next, in the next 5 to 10 years? What will remain afloat of this obsolete Soviet fleet? How much longer will these ancient Soviet first-rank ships, as well as the obsolete small third-rank ships, be able to sail? How long? 5 years at most? Or maybe even 10 years? After all, they are all already in a state of disrepair. They have long since exceeded their design lifespans. This means that in 5 or 10 years at most, all these obsolete ships will be decommissioned and sent for disposal. and replacements for them have not yet arrived. And it appears they never will, given the current ongoing trend of the Russian fleet's degradation. Moreover, as it turns out, replacements for them are not being produced at all. Because Russian industry has proven incapable of producing large first-rank ships. Although there was an attempt to begin serial production of such ships. And a very successful one at that. Let's clarify the details. In the early 2000s, the Russian military and industrialists developed a new first-class frigate. It turned out to be the Project 22350 Admiral Gorshkov-class multipurpose frigate. It was designed to replace the Soviet Project 1155 destroyers that were being retired. Construction of the first such ship began in 2006. The military ordered 10 of these ships at once. This was supposed to be the first batch of ships of this type. 3 of them were supposed to enter service with the Northern Fleet, 3 for the Black Sea Fleet, and 4 for the Pacific Fleet. The Pacific Fleet had exactly 4 aging Type 1155 destroyers. All of them were supposed to be decommissioned. And in their place, the fleet was supposed to receive new Russian frigates. However, the construction program for these ships failed. And the root of the problem was Ukraine. The first problem was that these ships were designed long before the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014. That is, before the war. Therefore, these ships were designed using Ukrainian components. In particular, the ship used the Ukrainian M55R propulsion system. It was manufactured at the world-renowned Zorya-Mashproekt enterprise. Consequently, Ukraine supplied propulsion units and other components for these ships. And they were successfully built. Russia even managed to build 3 such ships for the Northern Fleet. Incidentally, it turns out they won't be able to sail for long without Ukrainian components. And then, in 2014, Russia launched an invasion of Ukraine, and all military cooperation was interrupted. Ultimately, Russia built these ships, launched them, but couldn't complete them. Because there were no propulsion systems for them. So they sat idle until Russian manufacturers somehow found power plants for them. Perhaps they tried to purchase spare parts for these propulsion systems through third-party intermediaries. To avoid suspicion, they pointed out that Russian industry had managed to master the production of such units in Russia. This was the case with helicopter and aircraft engines previously produced by the Ukrainian company Motor-Sich. After the arrest of its director and the company's nationalization, helicopter engine production in Russia ground to a halt. It had stopped. And not for the first time. This happened first in 2014, at the beginning of the war. Then, apparently, the pro-Russian director of the company managed to establish engine supplies to Russia through intermediary countries. This is precisely what the Ukrainian Security Service stated upon his arrest. Basically, Ukrainian engines and components for them were finding their way to Russia. At the time, Russia claimed that the engines were being manufactured at the Petersburg Motors enterprise. However, after the arrest of the Ukrainian director and the cessation of supplies, this Russian enterprise virtually ceased production. At the very least, helicopter engine production ceased. Engines were being assembled there from Ukrainian components, which were shipped to Russia in defiance of sanctions. This is probably what happened with the ship engines. Russia immediately began to claim that its industry had mastered their production. However, if this were true, the construction of these ships would not have been delayed for many years or even decades. Let me remind you that Russia initially planned to build at least 20 such frigates over the next 15 to 20 years. The first was laid down in 2006. In fact, as of 2026, Russia has only commissioned 3 such frigates. So, in 20 years, only 3 of the minimum 20 frigates have been built. 2 more are still afloat, unfinished. Apparently, they are awaiting a Ukrainian power plant. If Russia completes their construction, it will mean that Russia has managed to obtain at least some of these Ukrainian power plants through intermediary countries. Thus, Ukrainian components could have found their way to Russia. After all, Ukraine has sold many similar power plants and their components to various countries around the world. Because there are many large ships worldwide that use gas turbine propulsion systems. And approximately 25 to 30% of these ships use Ukrainian gas turbine propulsion systems. Therefore, it is very difficult to track each buyer. Ultimately, it is possible that Russian industrialists somehow managed to obtain some of these components and, piece by piece, assembled propulsion systems for another one or two ships. Or perhaps the Russian military planned to try to obtain such components this way. But apparently, they were unsuccessful. Because for many years, these ships lay idle in the construction docks. Russia built the hulls, launched them, and there they waited to receive Ukrainian propulsion systems. Or perhaps the Russian military built these ships with the expectation that they would later capture Ukraine, specifically the city of Mykolaiv, where these propulsion systems are being built. Thus, all the problems of the Russian fleet would be immediately resolved. But Russia was unable to capture Ukraine, and was unable even to occupy the city of Mykolaiv in southern Ukraine. Therefore, all Russian plans to build these ships fell through once again. And their commissioning dates were constantly pushed back from year to year. This meant that Russia couldn't obtain the power plants for them. Nor could it buy similar ones from other developed countries, because they imposed sanctions on Russia in response to its invasion of Ukraine. Thus, the Russo-Ukrainian War dramatically impacted the ability of Russian industry to build large first-class surface ships. On the one hand, there was a breakdown in cooperation with Ukraine, and on the other, there were international sanctions against Russia. It turned out that Russia was incapable of building such ships on its own. And Russian industry was also incapable of independently creating such gas turbine power plants. Thus, due to the invasion of Ukraine, Russia lost the ability to build first-class ships, and in particular, the Admiral Gorshkov-class frigates of Project 22350. This means Russia has no replacement for the ancient Soviet first-class ships that are being retired. Therefore, the Russian Navy will continue to shrink, at least in terms of its large ships. And as an analysis of the Russian Pacific Fleet shows, Russia has no replacement for its aging Soviet destroyers and a guided missile cruiser. I'd also like to draw your attention to another option for constructing such new ships. For example, all 5 rank -1 ships of the Russian Pacific Fleet use Ukrainian propulsion systems. Some ships may have undergone major repairs shortly before the outbreak of the Russo-Ukrainian War, where they could have received new propulsion systems. There have been previous cases of the Russian military removing propulsion systems from such old ships and installing them on their own new ships. For example, this happened with some Project 1155 destroyers. The destroyers themselves were already obsolete, but their propulsion system still had significant service life. Russia would then decommission the old ship and install its propulsion system on a newly built Russian ship. This allowed Russia to commission new ships. However, the new ships couldn't sail for long with such a propulsion system. Such cases were recorded shortly after the outbreak of the Russo-Ukrainian War. After that, there was no longer any point in replacing them, because much time has passed since the severing of cooperation with Ukraine. And Ukrainian propulsion systems were expected to have exhausted their service life by 2026. This means there's no point in removing a worn-out propulsion system and installing it on a new ship. It won't be able to sail with it for long. Similarly, the old ships with such propulsion systems should have already exhausted not only their design life, but also the lifespan of their propulsion systems. This means Russia has lost not only the ability to produce large first-rank ships. It has also lost the ability to continue using its existing, aging large ships. After all, it's no longer possible to upgrade their propulsion systems without Ukraine. This means all of the Pacific Fleet's first-rank ships are in a state of disrepair, in part due to the deterioration of their propulsion systems. Simply put, Russia can't continue using them without Ukrainian propulsion systems and the components needed to maintain them. This means Russia won't be able to use this floating scrap metal for long. Therefore, these ships will have to be decommissioned and sent to the scrap yard in the near future. And no replacements have been built for them. Thus, the Russian Pacific Fleet has effectively lost all of its large first-rank ships. And with this, the entire Russian Navy has transformed from a global force to a local one. Also, from 1991 to 2026, Russia failed to deliver a single small third-rank combat ship to the Pacific Fleet. The fleet has only 8 of these ancient Soviet small combat ships. This means that in 5 to 10 years at the latest, the Pacific Fleet will lose all of its large first-rank ships and small third-rank combat ships. This means that the largest ships of the Russian Pacific Fleet will be medium-sized second-rank patrol ships. The fleet will also have small fourth-rank boats and cutters. In other words, the core of the fleet will be second- and fourth-rank ships. Patrol ships are light corvettes, such as the Steragashi or Gremyashi-class. They can be used to protect state borders. And cutters, such as the Grachanak-class, can be used for protection, for example, against poachers. There may also be some landing craft and cutters. That's the entire Russian Pacific Fleet. These are light corvettes and boats. There will also be a complete absence of large first-class naval vessels. This means the fleet will lack heavy cruisers, destroyers, frigates, and so on. Only light corvettes and border-protecting boats will remain. This is the ultimate outcome of the current development trend of the Russian Pacific Fleet. It is shrinking, and at this rate, soon all that will remain will be light corvettes and boats. In fact, the Russian Pacific Fleet has already transformed from a global fleet into a local fleet. And its decline continues as of 2026. After the collapse of the USSR, Russian industry failed to produce a single first-rank combat ship for the Navy. These are the ships that form the backbone of any ocean-going fleet. Second-rank ships are secondary, providing security and escort for first-rank ships. They operate in groups. This means that the main first-rank ships are constantly surrounded by smaller second-rank ships. Second-rank ships can also escort transport convoys. However, they are unable to independently achieve superiority on the high seas or in the ocean. For this, first-rank ships are needed. This is why these ships are the backbone of any ocean-going navy. And precisely because of this, such ships must be constantly updated to remain modern and combat-ready, to meet the conditions of modern combat. Without this, the entire navy rapidly loses its combat effectiveness. This is precisely what happened to the Russian fleet after the collapse of the USSR. Russia failed to update it in a timely manner. From 1991 to 2026, its strength steadily declined. Since the Russian Pacific Fleet has not received a single large, first-class surface ship during this entire period, the Russian military has been forced to continue using ancient Soviet scrap metal. They are constantly patching them up during repairs, trying to keep them afloat to prevent them from sinking. As the facts show, the large Russian Pacific Fleet, which could have carried out missions in distant waters, ceased to exist long ago. All that remains of it now is scrap metal, making it dangerous to sail at all. It could break down or sink. Instead, Russia began deploying smaller second-rank ships to this fleet. These are the ones that can operate in nearshore waters, that is, in its own coastal waters. It was second-rank corvettes that began to augment this fleet. For example, for Project 20380 Steragashi-class corvettes were delivered, as well as one Project 20385 Gremyashi-class corvette. All of these corvettes are second-rank ships. Their specifications state that they can be used in both near and long-range maritime zones. However, they can only be used in long-range zones in the presence of larger first-rank ships. Second-rank ships are used to escort first-rank ships. They are also used to ensure the safety of merchant ships and convoys at long ranges. By themselves, they are not used for operations in long-range maritime zones. This is militarily impractical. Because these are small ships, they serve to cover transport convoys or larger warships. And if large ships are unavailable, their use is only possible in the near-range maritime zone. As an example, consider the Russian Black Sea Fleet. While large first-rank ships were stationed there, Russia maintained a naval blockade of Ukraine. This happened immediately after Russia's invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022. Moreover, the Russian fleet had been well prepared for the invasion. From February 13 to 19, 2022, Russia conducted large-scale naval military exercises. There, it practiced blockading Ukraine in the Black Sea. And on February 24, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And the Russian fleet immediately began a blockade of Ukraine. The blockade was based on large ships, namely, first-rank ships, including the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the unsinkable missile cruiser Moskva. This is what it was called in Russia. As soon as Ukraine sank or damaged some of these ships, the blockade was lifted. For example, the heavy missile cruiser Moskva served as the entire fleet's defense against enemy aircraft. It carried numerous anti-aircraft missile systems and missiles. Under its protection, Russian ships maintained a naval blockade of Ukraine. Only after the Ukrainians sank this cruiser, the blockade was lifted. The Russian fleet was forced to retreat farther from the Ukrainian coast. It was then relocated from the Crimean Peninsula to Novorossiysk, in the eastern Black Sea region, farther from Ukrainian drones and missiles. The continuation of the Russo-Ukrainian War led to the demilitarization of the Russian army and navy. In the first 3 years of the war, the Russian fleet lost a third of its ships. Most of these losses were to the largest ships, damaged or sunk. Thus, the Russian Black Sea Fleet was transformed from a fleet into a flotilla. Second- and third-rank ships of the Russian fleet were no longer capable of maintaining control of the Black Sea. That is, they couldn't control even a relatively small sea. Ukraine, however, didn't have much of a navy. That is, it had no powerful adversary at sea. Even so, the loss of first-rank ships led to the complete loss of the combat capability of the entire Russian Black Sea Fleet. This is a clear example of how first-rank ships are the foundation of any fleet's strength. Without them, a fleet is unable to maintain control even in the near-sea zone. And so, Russia began replacing these ships in the Pacific Fleet with smaller second-rank frigates and corvettes. This means that the Russian Pacific Fleet has transformed from a long-distance navy into a short-distance fleet. Essentially, it has gone from being a global fleet to a local one. And it appears Russia has lost it forever. This is evidenced by the fact that since the collapse of the USSR and as of 2026, the Pacific Fleet has not received a single large first-rank surface ship. This means Russia has lost the ability to create and produce ships of this type. And with them, it has transformed from a global maritime power into a regional and even local one. The analysis also revealed that, in addition to the 5 new corvettes, this fleet was replenished primarily with ships of the 3rd and 4th ranks. These include 3 Alexandrite-class minesweepers, classified as 3rd-rank ships, or small vessels. 6 Project 21980 Grachanark special-purpose boats, 1 Project 11770 Cerna landing craft, and 1 Project 21820 Dyugan landing craft. That's all the Russian Pacific Fleet received from 1991 to 2026, 5 corvettes, 3 small minesweepers, and 8 boats. These are all small vessels and boats operating in the near-sea zone. They are designed to patrol borders and nearby waters to protect against poaching, illegal border crossings, and so on. In other words, they operate exclusively in the coastal zone. This once again confirms that Russia's long-range navy has degraded and become a short-range navy. Meanwhile, all Russian Pacific Fleet rearmament programs were aimed at acquiring approximately 50 new ships, at least 35 of which were first- and second-rank ships. Ultimately, the fleet received 5 second-rank light corvettes, 3 third-rank minesweepers, and 8 fourth-rank boats. That's the extent of Russia's naval development programs. In effect, it amounts to its degradation and demilitarization. By 2026, Russia has effectively lost its entire Pacific Fleet. After all, its core remains comprised of ancient Soviet ships that are in disrepair. They have lost their combat effectiveness and are unable to fulfill their assigned combat missions. The same applies to the submarine fleet. In all the years since the collapse of the USSR, Russia has only been able to deliver 2 Yasen-M Class 885M nuclear submarines to the Navy. These are the only new submarine deliveries from 1991 to 2026. And the Project 09852 special-purpose submarine delivered, the BS-329 Belgorod, is not new, even though it entered service with the Navy in 2022. Because, in fact, it is already long outdated. Its construction began in 1992 under the Soviet submarine construction program. But the Russian Federation was only able to complete this submarine in 2019. That's when it was launched for testing. and it only entered service with the Navy 2 years later. In fact, the Russian Navy has received only 2 truly new submarines as of 2026. This is extremely small. Of the diesel submarines, the Navy received only 6 Project 636.3 Varyag submarines. These were designed for export during the Soviet era. They are a simplified version of the ancient Soviet Project 877 Polta submarine. Russia was unable to develop its own new diesel submarine, so it decided to build Soviet export versions of the 636.3 Varyag submarines. This means that these submarines cannot be called new. Russia simply continued producing these ancient Soviet submarines. This is how they ended up in the Pacific Fleet. However, I would like to emphasize that these are export versions. This means they have reduced capabilities compared to the basic ancient Soviet Project 877 Polta submarines. It was these simplified Varyags that were replaced. In other words, the combat capabilities of the submarine fleet have not increased, but even decreased. As for the 5 new nuclear-powered missile carriers, they are not designed for combat operations at sea or in the ocean. Their primary purpose is to covertly deliver nuclear missiles to their launch sites. They must always remain hidden from a potential adversary. This means they are not part of a combat fleet designed to achieve naval superiority. This is more relevant to Russia's nuclear triad. The Russian fleet itself has been reduced and, in fact, obsolete, degraded, and Russia is unable to restore it. Russia has decided to devote all its resources to supporting the nuclear triad, rather than the combat effectiveness of its surface and submarine fleets. In fact, it can be concluded that the Russian Pacific Fleet, after the collapse of the USSR, was sharply reduced and subsequently degraded. And Russia's industry has proven incapable of restoring it. It's also worth noting that Russia has only 2 global-level fleets, the Pacific and Northern fleets. This is because they possess a significant number of first-rank ships. Although most of these are outdated, they are capable of operating autonomously anywhere in the world's oceans and seas. The Pacific Fleet is Russia's second most powerful fleet, after the Northern Fleet. Therefore, the next fleet we'll examine is the Northern Fleet. His analysis will be presented to you in our next video review of the Russian Navy. There, we'll show its numerical composition and the actual condition of its ships. We'll also show how this fleet deteriorated after the collapse of the USSR and how Russia failed to restore it. The second part of our video review will be featured in the end credits at the end of this video. A link is also available in the description below this video. That's all I have for now. A special thanks to everyone who supports the channel. Your help is greatly appreciated. Like it. Leave a comment and subscribe to the channel, where many more interesting and engaging videos await. Thanks for watching.